1 year after Woodrow Wilson's election as President of the United States, Europe went to war. Wilson had pledged to continue the progressive reforms that were improving American government, business, work, and living conditions. Sadly, just 4 years later, President Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war against Germany. Extenuating world events had changed his mind, and America entered World War I. It was called by some the war to end all wars. Socialists dubbed it the Imperialist War. Soldiers often called it the Trench War. World War I was, in fact, the first modern war, a war waged with the ingenuity of the industrial age, from telegraphs to tanks, movies to machine guns. Despite being a modern war, the roots of World War I were steeped in Europe's tumultuous past. As far back as 1870, France and Germany were enemies. When Germany won the Franco-Prussian War, it seized 2 French provinces, Alsace and Lorraine. From then on, a competitiveness for European leadership evolved between the 2 countries, and a spirit of nationalism gripped them both. This nationalism went far beyond simply maintaining patriotic feelings for one's country. Instead, Germany, France, and other European countries believed that the interests of their homeland should always be put ahead of world cooperation. The resulting contempt for one country by another inevitably led to the risk of war. Nationalism was at the root of conflicts between Russia and Austria-Hungary. Russians believed that they were the protector of all of Europe's Slavic people, regardless of which government they happened to live under. For example, Serbia was an independent country, but millions of other Serbs lived under Austria-Hungary's rule. The result was an intense rivalry between Russia and Austria-Hungary for influence over Serbians in the country of Serbia. Poland had been divided among Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia, and wanted to reunite in their own Polish state with self-rule. The Czechoslovakians also wanted freedom and self-determination. Under Austria-Hungary's rule, they were not even allowed to use their own language. Consequently, by 1914, Europe was a hotbed of nationalism, and tensions ran high between the governments and their constituents. While the spirit of nationalism flourished across Europe, many countries were building their global empires. Great Britain and Germany were colonizing Africa and the Middle East in a frenzy of imperialism. France and Germany were now rivals at home and abroad as they clashed over control of Morocco. Russia turned its attention to Europe as she sought control over the Serbs. The contest for international trade, resources, and land soon resulted in a buildup of military strength. The British, Germans, French, Italians, Japanese, and Americans began an arms race, stockpiling weapons, recruiting armies, and launching battleships to protect their interests at home and abroad. As each country amassed countless weapons and beefed up their army and navies, they saw the wisdom of agreeing to military alliances, mutual treaties of assistance that would commit each nation to support one another should they be attacked. By 1914, there were 2 major defense alliances. The Triple Entente, later called the Allies, consisted of France, Great Britain, and Russia, although Russia had a separate treaty with Serbia. The other, the Triple Alliance, later called the Central Powers, included Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Italy. Italy would later join the Allies. For a little while, these military alliances served as a type of checks and balances system, with each nation reluctant to upset the balance of power. But despite these alliances, war soon erupted. A single event would soon tip the scale. On June 28, 1914, in the capital of Bosnia, a village called Sarajevo, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and his wife Sophie were waving to the happy crowds from their motorcade, when a young man leapt from the sidewalk and shot them both dead. The assassin turned out to be a member of a secret society called the Black Hand, whose goal was to reunite all Serbs under one rule. The assassination was used by the Austria-Hungary government as an opportunity to make an example of Serbia and squelch any nationalist uprisings in the future. 1 month later, Austria-Hungary declared war against Serbia. If it weren't for the military alliances, it might have been a relatively small, localized conflict. Instead, one nation after another was pulled into the fight due to their treaties of support. In order to aid its Serbian allies, Russia mobilized its armed forces. Germany, who was obligated by treaty to support Austria-Hungary, declared war on Russia 2 days after that. Subsequently, Germany declared war on Russia's ally, France. And 1 day later, Great Britain, who had a treaty with France, declared war on Germany and Austria-Hungary. World War I had begun. As Germany invaded the neutral country of Belgium, no one foresaw how long the war would last and how gruesome the cost would be. Over 65 million people fought. Over 20 million were wounded. Between 9 and 10 million died on the battlefield, and another 20 million lost their lives due to hunger and disease related to the war. The magnitude of the killing was unprecedented. In just the first 3 months of the war, nearly the entire original British Army was wiped out. Despite all the carnage, the battle lines remained almost stationary in France. The Western Front, as it was known, was defined by 2 lines of trenches, zigzagging across northern and eastern France for thousands of miles. Wide enough for 2 men to walk abreast and stand erect to fire their machine guns, the trenches were choked with mire, rats, and lice. German soldiers occupied one line, Allied soldiers the other. Between them lay a no-man's land, filled with barbed wire and mud, smoldering with bomb craters. From time to time, soldiers would storm out of these trenches and attempt to overrun the enemy, only to be met with a hail of bullets. Both sides suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties while accomplishing practically nothing, as the battle lines remained essentially unchanged. Meanwhile, the tools of technology, which had provided prosperity for the industrialized world, were now being used to create more efficient and more ghastly weapons. A soldier described the shocking sight of a machine gun that could fire 500 to 600 bullets per minute.
I saw trees as large as a man's thigh, literally cut down by the stream of lead.
In 1914, the German army deployed their new cannon against Belgium. Big Bertha, as it was called, could hurl an 1,800-pound shell 9 miles. A year later, at the Second Battle of Ypres, the Germans introduced poison gas to warfare. Soon, both sides used chemical weapons like chlorine, which suffocated its victims, or mustard gas that burned the skin and blinded its casualties. By 1916, the British Army began using tanks in battle with great success. Before long, however, German soldiers realized that flamethrowers, weapons that could shoot a stream of flaming gasoline, could be used to stop them. Balloons and then airplanes were converted into weapons of war. When Germany attacked the Belgian city of Liège in 1914, it was the first time civilians were killed by a warplane. Planes were fitted with machine guns and loaded with bombs, and soon began dueling in air-to-air combat. These dogfights became a common sight over the skies of Europe. Germany's leading fighter pilot, Manfred Richter, Nicknamed the Red Baron by the British because of his brightly painted red Albatross airplane, shot down 80 Allied aircraft before being struck by a bullet from the trenches and crashing to his death.
If I should come out of this war alive, I will have more luck than brains.
Even more destruction was waiting on and under the Atlantic Ocean as Germany pressed its Unterseeboots, its submarines, into the battle. German submarines, U-boats, patrolled the Atlantic, firing torpedoes on merchant ships trying to deliver supplies to the Allies. It aroused the anger of Americans in particular because they felt that this was a violation of the principle of the freedom of the seas, long a cornerstone of United States foreign policy. Germany then launched a U-boat blockade in response to the British blockade along the German coast, which in theory prevented contraband, weapons, and military supplies from reaching Germany. But the British definition of contraband was wide-sweeping, including food and fertilizer for crops. 750,000 Germans died of starvation during the British blockade. 75,000 people lost their lives due to German submarine warfare. The blockades continued the pattern of war begun in the trenches. Everywhere, the fighting was inconclusive, while the new technologically advanced weapons made the lack of victories more devastating. Into this battle of death and despair came the United States in the spring of 1917, despite President Woodrow Wilson's promise that the U.S. could stay neutral.
So far as I can remember, this is a government of the people, and this people is not going to choose war.
Most Americans, though they felt sympathy for the plight of Europeans, saw no reason to join a fight 3,000 miles away. At the time of Wilson's second inauguration, immigrants constituted 1/3 of the United States population. More than 8 million German Americans lived in the U.S. and naturally felt sympathy toward their former homeland. America had the closest ties with the Allies. The U.S. shared a common language and history with England and many democratic institutions. America traded with Great Britain and France twice as much as with Germany, and stories of German war atrocities had outraged many citizens of all ethnic backgrounds. Still, most Americans wanted to remain neutral, but that was not to be, primarily for two reasons. America entered the war largely to ensure that the Allies would be able to repay the huge debts owed to the United States, and America had to prevent Germany from threatening U.S. shipping. A change in American attitude occurred when the British ship Lusitania was sunk by a German U-boat. Of the 1,198 who were killed, there were 128 Americans. More ships were sunk, incurring more loss of American lives. When the German Kaiser announced on January 31st, 1917, that U-boats would sink all ships in British waters, whether they were hostile or neutral, there seemed little choice but to enter the war. The discovery of the Zimmermann telegram cemented that decision. It was a coded note from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the German minister in Mexico, promising U.S. territory to Mexico in return for joining the German cause.
We make Mexico a proposal or alliance on the following basis: make war together, make peace together, generous financial support, and an understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona.
A little over a month later, Congress formally declared war on Germany and the Central Powers. The American public was shocked, but there was still no rush to enlist. The result was that Congress voted overwhelmingly for a draft, requiring eligible men to register with the government. Of the 24 million who signed up, 3 million were chosen by lottery to serve. Women were not drafted, and the Army would not even let them enlist. The Navy and Marines accepted women volunteers for non-combat positions. 13,000 served as nurses, clerks, stenographers, secretaries, and telephone operators. Women could become Army nurses, but they did not receive the benefits, equal pay, or military rank of Army men. The number of African Americans who served in World War I was double their proportion in the general population. African American soldiers were segregated into separate units and living quarters, and were not allowed to join the Navy or the Marines. For the first time in history, some African Americans were trained to be Army officers, though they were only allowed to be in charge of African American troops. The renowned all-African American 369th Infantry Regiment, dubbed the Harlem Hellfighters, saw more continuous duty on the front lines than any other American regiment. Two of the 369th soldiers were the first Americans ever to receive the French military honor, the Cross of War. Of course, before any American soldiers were able to fight in World War I, the United States had to get troops and supplies to Europe. The costs of such an operation were staggering. To raise money and get the resources needed, the United States government implemented extraordinary measures. First, the federal government took control of the economy and gave the president the power to fix prices and regulate certain war-related industries. President Wilson next established the War Industries Board and appointed millionaire financial expert Bernard Baruch to head it. Wilson often called him Dr. Facts because of his ability to assemble, coordinate, and distribute details about war materials and production.
Every man has a right to be wrong in his opinions, but no man has a right to wrong in his facts.
No detail, however seemingly trivial, escaped his scrutiny. Baruch noticed that 8,000 tons of steel were used each year to make ladies' corsets. He asked American women to give up that fashion in support of the war. They did, and the steel saved could be employed to build 2 battleships. The board encouraged companies to use mass production techniques to increase efficiency and eliminate waste. It also established price controls, allocated raw materials, and told manufacturers what they needed to produce in order to help the war effort. As a result, industrial production increased by 20%. Other government agencies controlled the railroads, regulated the use of coal and oil, and mediated labor disputes, avoiding crippling strikes. The War Industries Board also created a massive publicity campaign, encouraging the public to contribute to the war effort by planting victory gardens and observing meatless meals, so food could be sent overseas to the troops. Gasless Sundays and lightless nights soon followed.
My Tuesdays are meatless. My Wednesdays are wheatless. I'm getting more eatless every day.
In order to conserve energy, the War Industries Board even adopted an idea first championed by Benjamin Franklin: daylight savings time, to take advantage of the longer days of summer and use less electricity. And finally, to raise the $33 billion cost of the war, the government took 2 actions. First, it established an excess profits or war profits tax on corporate earnings and higher income taxes on wealthier citizens. Taxes were raised on tobacco, liquor, and luxury goods as well. These actions collected about 1/3 of the money needed. The rest was raised by appealing to Americans' strong sense of patriotism. Liberty bonds were sold. These, in essence, loaned money to the government to fight the war. Movie stars and newspapers, parades and billboards all carried the message to buy bonds. Amazingly, on average, every adult American lent the war effort about $400, a large amount at the time. Even with the money necessary to fight the war, the government realized they would need the popular support of Americans, most of whom had been either neutral or openly against involvement. Therefore, President Wilson appointed a former muckraking journalist, George Creel, to head the Committee on Public Information, our nation's first propaganda agency. Creel was a giant when it came to advertising and public relations. He called his committee the world's greatest adventure in advertising. Creel convinced the best writers, artists, musicians, and advertising people of the day to help him sell the war. From booklets and books for Americans in various languages to anti-government propaganda messages for our enemies. Creel even got into the movie business with features such as Under Four Flags, with the help of famous film director D.W. Griffith. These pro-war movies were not only hits, they actually made money for the cause. $852,744. Remarkable when you realize that it only cost a nickel to see a movie back then. Simply put, Creel helped make an unpopular war popular. His masterstroke was the creation of a national force of 75,000 men who would deliver a patriotic 4-minute speech anytime, anywhere. The 4-minute men spoke on the draft, rationing, bond drives, and victory gardens. By the end of the war, they had delivered more than 7.5 million speeches to 314 million listeners. Musicians gave voice to the war. Songs like Till We Meet Again, It's a Long, Long Way to Tipperary, Keep the Home Fires Burning, and Over There kept American spirits high. Meanwhile, the immense task of transporting troops to France began. After years of relying on foreign vessels to take American goods overseas, America's supply of ships was limited. Consequently, shipyard workers were exempt from the draft or given deferments to make shipbuilding a priority industry. A new construction technique called fabrication, a process by which parts were built elsewhere and then assembled in a central shipyard, substantially reduced the time needed to build ships. The system worked and worked well. In a single day, appropriately the 4th of July, 1918, America launched 95 ships. Rear Admiral William S. Sims decided that the best way to get troops and supplies safely past the German U-boats was to use a convoy system. That meant that merchant and troop transport ships would cross the Atlantic in large groups, escorted by a guard of heavily armed destroyers and cruisers, circling the fleet. The plan cut shipping losses in half. 100 submarine chaser boats and 500 airplanes were also used to stop U-boats from sinking ships bound for Europe. Remarkably, of the 2 million men who sailed to Europe during the war, only 100 were lost to U-boat torpedoes. General John J. Pershing led the American Expeditionary Force. Pershing believed in aggressive action in combat and was highly regarded by his superiors and the men he commanded. Black Jack, as he was popularly known among the troops, was understood to be fair, courageous, and a top-notch administrator. At first, American troops were employed mainly as replacements for European casualties. By April of 1918, Pershing convinced the Allies that Americans should fight as a separate army.
We came American, we shall remain American, and go into battle with Old Glory over our heads. I will not parcel out American boys.
Accordingly, American soldiers, called doughboys because of their white belts that they cleaned with pipe clay or dough, fought together under the command of French Marshal Ferdinand Foch. By now, the government of Russia had been overthrown by the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin. And Russia withdrew from the war, signing a peace treaty with Germany. This meant the Germans could now consolidate their army and concentrate on a single front. By May of 1918, the Germans managed to get within 50 miles of Paris. America had arrived over there just in time to help stop the German advance at Cantigny. A few weeks later, the doughboys helped thwart the German attacks at Château-Thierry and below Wood and Reims. In late summer, the Allies, with America's help, triumphed in the Second Battle of the Marne, and in September mounted offensives against Germans at Saint-Mihiel and in the Meuse-Argonne regions, where 1.2 million U.S. troops fought. By October, it was clear the tide had turned against Germany and the Central Powers, as German troops began to retreat all along the front. The victory was not without devastating cost, however. All told, the United States lost 48,000 men in battle. Approximately 62,000 died of disease, and another 200,000 were wounded and needed immediate medical care.
The army is only 12 miles away. I have Americans, English, Irish, and French, and apart, in the corners, are Germans. They have to watch each other die side by side. The cannon goes day and night, and the shells are breaking over and around us. I have to write many sad letters to American mothers.
Thankfully, an end to the slaughter was not far off. Although on the home front, the effects of the war were enormous. From fines and imprisonment for those who opposed the war to new roles for women and African Americans, World War I was proving to be a major turning point in American history.